Alright guys, today we are back with chapter 35 looking at Reconstruction. And I want to go ahead and brag about myself real quick. These guided notes, I did a great job getting political cartoons into this version. So I might actually spend some time looking at these political cartoons and taking a look at what they're saying, especially as newsprint is getting more and more technologically advanced. And newspapers are selling more and more copies. There's more and more available. Printing is getting better and better. We're gonna start to get some amazing you know political commentary coming out of these cartoons. And in some ways, I feel like it's a golden age. Kind of this back half of the 19th century of political cartoons in America. But anyway, just wanted to highlight that real quick before we got started. All right, so Reconstruction, what is it? Okay, it's the rebuilding period following the Civil War. Okay, the dates are generally seen as 1865 to 1877. It's characterized though by chaos, lots of questions, lots of suffering, lots of identity shifting. Rethinking what is America and what is America with the South back in it, and what is the South if it is lost, right? So a lot of questions need to be answered, and these five that I put down. On what terms would the Confederacy be allowed back into the Union? Of course, use a question mark. Who would direct the reentry, Congress or the President? What would happen to free blacks in the South? Would black men have the same status as white men in the South and in the North? And then what should we do with Confederate leaders, right? So these are the major questions that we're going to need to figure out as we kind of march through the decade or so after the Civil War. This we could characterize Reconstruction in many ways as still a war, right? But this time it's between radical Northerners who want to punish the South and Southerners who want to preserve their way of life, okay? Slavery is dead, of course, with the Civil War, and we get a host of new amendments, so literal changes to the Constitution. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that did the following. 13th abolished slavery in all states and territories. The 14th made it illegal to deprive any male citizen of equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment gave the right to vote to all African American men, right? So here we have all African American men being able to vote in 1867, but no women will get the right to vote till 1919. Okay, something to chew on. All these needed to be requirements for a southern state to re-enter the Union. So the states had to approve these amendments or to get back in, which of course they probably never would have done. All right. Reconstruction will have two separate phases. There'll be presidential Reconstruction from 1865 to 67, right? And this is going to be a very, very lenient period, all right, led by President Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, of course, becomes president after Lincoln was shot. He was vice president. Blacks, though, underneath his presidency find themselves in social positions very similar to that of the pre-war South, okay? So not much changes. Johnson's a huge racist, no way around it, okay? Which is interesting that he is Lincoln's vice president, this president that we associate with kind of like, as the Moses of ending slavery. Next phase is going to be congressional Reconstruction. This starts with the elections in 1866 that brought a group known as the Radical Republicans into power, but they, of course, do not take office till 67. So their kind of reign of sorts doesn't start until 67. This group wants to punish the South. They pass a series of intense laws. The primary one being the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, and this act divided the South into military districts, made sure that blacks were able to vote and hold office, and as well as become judges and police chiefs, right? And it also meant that the North would send down troops to enforce this legislation if the South did not comply. Andrew Johnson responds by vetoing all the message. He's overridden by Congress each and every time, and this antagonism between him and Congress is going to eventually lead to his impeachment in 1868, but not his removal from office. We'll get into why that happened in a minute. Southerners will respond with violence and intimidation in the South. The Ku Klux Klan is born, right? And of course, this body is its purpose is to make sure that Republicans from the North and the South, as well as free blacks, know their place as second-class citizens. They'll be terrorized, raped, hung. I mean, you name it, right? The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacy groups will officially break American laws to basically see blacks become second-class citizens again. Reconstruction will end in 1877 when Union troops withdraw, and this will institute a new period of segregation inside of the United States that really doesn't end for about another 90 years. So, all this progress is made in the Reconstruction era and is quickly abandoned. And in fact, many of it is actually reversed as we kind of go through the last part of the 19th century and into the 20th. And we look at Reconstruction and we say, man, this is a pretty amazing time for the progression of black rights in America. And in no other decade, between 1867 and 1877, do we see the progression of black rights ascend more than in this decade, and that includes the 60s. Okay, the 60s was about actually making sure that the laws that were made and the amendments that were made in the 1860s and 70s were enforced, right? And not to say that huge strides were made in the 60s, but the actual laws are on the books in the 1860s and 70s and just are basically willfully ignored. Now, presidential reconstruction, what's going on here? Okay, now let's take a look at Andrew Johnson. Where is he coming from? He's a running mate of Lincoln in 1864 election. Lincoln knows that he needs Southern support, and Andrew Johnson's from Tennessee. Andrew Johnson does not support upper class slave-holding ideas. He is against what is known as a slavocracy, or slaveocracy, which is a society built on slavery, built on the rich ruling class owning slaves. He is against this. Okay, that doesn't mean he's not a racist. Okay, Johnson thinks Southern states should basically decide what should be done in each and every state and whether they should be freed or not. He also felt that African Americans couldn't manage their own lives and that they shouldn't vote, right? Which is going to be completely at odds with the radical Republicans. He is okay with the passage of black codes. These are harsh laws that basically held African Americans as second-class citizens. This is kind of the Jim Crow laws that we've mentioned before. Okay, they'll kind of come back in. And basically, notice how we had slave codes, now we have black codes, right? So we can't have slavery anymore, but we can definitely keep blacks as second-class citizens. And many of these same codes are the same, right? You can't own guns. They couldn't prohibit them from meeting together anymore, but many of these codes are the same. Johnson will use his presidential pardon to pardon Southerners who fought in the Civil War. He does this 7,000 times. Presidents can pardon anybody of any crime if they so please, right? So President Johnson basically makes sure that nobody in the South can be convicted of treason as a result of their participation in the Civil War. Now, Johnson's also against this new organization known as the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was created in order to make it possible for slaves to transition into the world of the free blacks, right? Or transition, kind of healthily into the world of commerce and political independence. Let me get the year for you. Yeah, 1865. This was actually, passed before Lincoln was shot. So, Lincoln saw the Freedmen's Bureau as a necessary endeavor to make sure that slaves could enter into the world around them and not just kind of get sucked back into a subservient status underneath those who already own land. We'll see that doesn't really exist, especially when the Freedmen's Bureau is disbanded. But still, it at least shows the federal government is looking out for blacks in America. Some of these black codes I mentioned before. All right, there are restrictions, of course. I'll give you a list right here. They needed evidence of employment or had to go back to plantations, right? They had to pay a special tax if they were not farmers or servants. They were unable to own guns or hunt and fish, and some lands couldn't go to parks, schools, orphanages, or other public areas. So certainly with the passage of these codes, blacks will become second-class citizens once again, even though they have these protections of these new amendments. Now, countering presidential reconstruction is Congressional Reconstruction, or Radical Reconstruction. Okay, this was led by two men, Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, both in Congress. They thought the South should be punished severely. Right, Thaddeus Stevens is from Pennsylvania. Sumner is from Massachusetts. He, of course, was the guy that was beat up by Preston Brooks before the Civil War. And they feel like the South should really, basically be punished for their participation in treason against the United States. Okay, they helped with the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, a law guaranteeing the basic rights to all in the U.S. All right, this, of course, will be vetoed by Johnson. It is overridden, though, and it becomes law anyway. They also passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, all right, which gives the right to vote and to blacks and also allows them to seek office. But that right is going to be removed from Confederate leaders. So if you are a Confederate leader, you cannot vote or seek office anymore. It divides the South into 5 military districts, and it protects black property and citizens. All these acts, like I mentioned, are going to be vetoed by Andrew Johnson. Why is he doing it? Well, it really is kind of as simple as the fact that he was a racist. All right, he really does think that blacks shouldn't get equal social status with whites. He feels like they already had the constitutional rights protected anyway, like life and property. He didn't think they needed to be able to make as much money or have access to the same areas or facilities as whites, right? That is a racist attitude. So Andrew Johnson does not want to see blacks and whites sharing equal spaces. He certainly thinks that they are human beings and have the right to their life and have the right to own property and all that sort of stuff, but they don't have the right to rub shoulders with white Americans. Republicans, sorry to skip around, but Republicans are intervening in state affairs, of course. Why? They're making sure that black rights are protected. Otherwise, they're not going to be, and we have proof in that. And that as soon as they don't interfere anymore in 1877, that blacks basically have their rights yanked away. Okay. They also want to make sure that Southern states are punished and that the Civil War isn't fought for nothing, right? So if we just let the South back in and they keep treating blacks as second-class citizens, then why do we fight this huge war where 640,000 people died? So radical Republicans want to make sure that it meant something, right? And this, of course, we've mentioned. They passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? The Civil Rights Bill, the Reconstruction Act. And they also make sure that Southern Unionists will be those who are going to be in power in the South. Of course, Andrew Johnson is a Southern Unionist, right? And he doesn't necessarily want to see old Confederates taking over. He wants to make sure as well that those who support the Union will be in power. But it turns out that most of these Southern Unionists are going to side with the radical Republicans more so than the people like Andrew Johnson. All right, we've mentioned already that Johnson and Congress are going to lock horns, and as a result of this, Johnson will get impeached. Okay, now what is impeachment? Okay, impeachment is not removal from office. Impeachment is just a formal charging of an elected official, right? In this case, the president with Andrew Johnson by Congress. And specifically the House of Representatives in Congress. It doesn't mean removal. So if you are impeached, it doesn't mean that you're going to be removed from office. It just means you're going to be charged, okay? There's 2 stages to this. 1, we've already mentioned that the House charges an official with the articles of impeachment. And 2, there's a trial by the Senate, okay? Impeachable offenses include treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Notice how this is fairly vague, right? What is a high crime or misdemeanors, right? Well, it's up to Congress to decide. And they decide that, and we'll talk about this episode of how Johnson is impeached, but basically the firing of the Secretary of War is an impeachable offense, okay? Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War underneath the Johnson administration, all right, his job is to enforce the Reconstruction Act. Johnson tries to remove him. Well, his removal from office is a violation of the Tenure of Office Act. And the Tenure of Office Act, which actually is going to be declared unconstitutional later, all right, basically makes it illegal for any president to remove somebody from office that hasn't served a given amount of years. And this is to basically limit the president's ability to shake up the leadership both in the cabinet and with other appointed officials. If there's an exchange of power, such as when Lincoln dies, right, and Johnson comes to power, right? So, it's declared unconstitutional later because Congress doesn't have the right to limit the executive branch in that manner. But still, at the time, this is a law in the books. Johnson violates this law or tries to violate the law, and he is impeached. All right, he's impeached because he doesn't comply with the Tenure of Office Act. All right, there's no vice president at this time. Next in line would be this guy Benjamin Wade. All right, so just keep in mind he's a radical Republican. Right, so it behooves the radical Republicans to get rid of Johnson to get somebody else in power that is more, sympathetic with their ideals. He has 11 articles of impeachment brought against him. He is very close from getting removed from office. He's one vote shy. 35 vote to remove him. 7 senators will jump across party lines from Republican to Democrat to make sure that he stays in office, right? So not everybody feels like this is going to be, a pure violation of the law or really truly a high crime or misdemeanor. And Johnson will serve out the rest of his term in office until Ulysses S. Grant runs for president in 1872 and wins. Okay. All right. Last section here we're going to call rebuilding the old order. All right. This refers to, of course, the old racist social hierarchy in which whites are on top of blacks in the South. How does this happen? Well, initially, there's actually quite a bit to celebrate during the Reconstruction period. Hiram Revels will become the first black American senator for Mississippi in 1870. PBS Pinchback will become the first black governor in Louisiana in 1872, right? So there's progress, right, before Reconstruction ends. And Southern whites, of course, have their liberties limited. They can't vote or hold office. Their estates are broken up. Free blacks will be able to compete with poor whites for jobs and land, right? Southern blacks will be able to vote and hold office and own land. Could be sheriffs, judges, and could be on school boards and city councils. So a lot of movement going on economically and politically for blacks in the South, right? The South Carolina legislature was vast majority black, right? So, it's kind of weird to see these pictures from the 1860s and 70s with legislatures filled with African Americans. But the truth is, old Confederates couldn't vote, all right, which got rid of a lot of the white vote. In these areas, free blacks are the vast majority of the population, because basically the plantations owned enormous amounts of slaves, and they are able to vote in people of like mind and color, all right? At the same time, though, there's a competing system known as the sharecropping system, and this is the system. It's basically slavery in a new form. Wealthy whites allow poor blacks to work on their land, and kind of in compensation, they're allowed a certain amount of the yield from that land to sell on the market. Some of it goes back to the landowner. Okay, basically, what it leads to though is a system of debt. Sharecroppers had to borrow basically all their supplies and money from the landowners, and if their debt was more than the revenue they brought in, then they had to stay on the plantation. Right, they were basically locked into debt. So, in a nutshell, they're chained to the land owner in a system of debt, not necessarily as property of that landowner. Okay. We also see, two new groups basically come into the South. Literally from the North, carpetbaggers come into the South to take advantage of this destitute economic system and political system. And their goal is to get rich quickly and seize power if they can in the political offices. Scallywags will be Southerners who ally themselves with carpetbaggers. And they are hated by Southerners who kind of fought with the Confederacy. They're seen as opportunists, right, who are basically feeding on the devastation of the South, while ex-Confederates cannot vote or hold office, right, or and they're kind of staring at being very, very poor right now. Okay. Out of this comes resentment and hatred, not just for carpetbaggers and scallywags, but for blacks. And what we see is new organizations, the KKK, Knights of the White Camellia, the White Brotherhood, who are going to, come into existence and increase their their membership to the point where they have a vast following and they engage in all sorts of um, you know crimes against blacks and other whites in the South, including lynchings using terror and violence and rape, and there's outright massacre to check the growing power, political and economic power of free blacks and, of course, any whites who would support them. Okay. Um, White Southerners will also start sidestepping the 15th Amendment by having poll taxes and literacy tests and even outright violence at the ballot box to make sure that Southern blacks, free blacks, do not have access to the 15th Amendment. And that's why we see this change in voting, right? In 1877, when Union troops are evacuated, basically it is, the death knell of black empowerment in the South. And many of these advances that we see and all these, pieces of legislation on the books end up getting abandoned. And we'll go right back to the system that we were in before the Civil War, the only difference being that blacks in America can no longer be considered property as slaves. Okay. All right. Well, good luck with your questions. Let me know if you need anything. Thanks so much.